It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Beau Sterling laughed as he poured the vintage champagne over Sloane's head in front of the entire gala. The pale, expensive liquid cascaded down her forehead, stinging her eyes and soaking into the collar of her white silk gown. Around them, the hum of the Sterling estate's ballroom died into a sharp, collective intake of breath. The string quartet continued to play a jaunty Vivaldi piece, the upbeat tempo mocking the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. Sloane Sterling didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still as the alcohol dripped from her chin, the scent of fermented grapes and yeast filling her senses. She could feel the eyes of 200 of the city's elite boring into her. Among them, Juliana Vane watched from the edge of the dance floor, her diamond-encrusted hand pausing midair as she raised a lorgnette to her eye, her expression one of amused pity. "Oops," Beau said, his voice loud enough to carry to the back of the hall. He didn't look sorry. His face was flushed with the arrogance of a man who believed the world was his personal playground. He adjusted his silk tie, the gold Rolex on his wrist catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. "I guess I forgot you were standing there, Sloane. You're just so invisible in that dress. It's a bit drab for a 30th birthday, don't you think?" A few of his cronies chuckled, men in tailored tuxedos who owed their positions to Beau's supposed genius. Sloane looked past her brother toward the head table. Her mother, Eleanor Sterling, was carefully smoothing a napkin over her lap, her gaze fixed firmly on her salad. Arthur Sterling sat beside her, his jaw tight, staring at his wine glass as if it held the secrets of the universe. Neither of them moved to help her. Neither of them spoke. "It's a $5,000 vintage, Beau," Sloane said, her voice remarkably level. She reached up and calmly wiped a drop of champagne from her eyelash. "A waste of good profit." "Profit?" Beau barked a laugh, stepping closer until she could smell the gin on his breath. He leaned in, lowering his voice but maintaining that sharp, jagged edge. "Don't talk to me about profit. You're a glorified bookkeeper for a mid-market firm. I'm the CEO of a multi-million-dollar empire. I am the profit. You should be thanking me for the shower. You smelled like a dusty library anyway." He turned back to the crowd, raising his empty glass. "A toast. To my sister, the most boring woman in the city. May she finally find a husband who can tolerate her personality as much as I tolerate her audits." The room erupted into polite, forced laughter. Eleanor Sterling finally looked up, offering Sloane a thin, apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Go clean yourself up, darling," her mother mouthed. "You're making a scene." Sloane turned and walked toward the grand staircase, the wet silk of her dress clinging to her legs like a cold, second skin. Each step felt heavy, the sound of her heels on the marble floor echoing like a countdown. She felt the weight of the small, beaded clutch in her hand. Inside was her phone, and on that phone was a secure link to a file Marcus Thorne had finalized an hour before the party began. She reached the shadows of the second-floor gallery and stopped, looking down at the spectacle below. Beau was already the center of attention again, regaling a group of investors with a story about his latest acquisition. A deal Sloane knew was funded by a series of forged signatures and offshore accounts he thought she hadn't noticed. He thought she was the quiet auditor who lived in his shadow. He thought she was the daughter who stayed silent so the family name wouldn't tarnish. He had no idea that the invisible woman he had just humiliated was the sole beneficial owner of Vanguard Holdings, the very entity that held 70% of his company's debt. Her phone vibrated against her palm. She pulled it out. A message from Marcus Thorne sat on the screen. "Everything is in place. The forensic report on the signature forgery is verified. The board meeting is in 48 hours. Do you want to proceed?" Sloane looked down at the ballroom. She watched Beau throw his head back in another boisterous laugh, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a young woman who looked terrified of him. She watched her mother whisper something to Juliana Vane, likely an excuse for Sloane's clumsiness. The sting of the champagne in her eyes had faded, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. For years, she had played the role of the dutiful, overlooked daughter, watching as Beau bled the family legacy dry to fund his narcissistic fantasies. She had waited for a sign of remorse, a moment of sibling loyalty, or even a shred of parental protection. Instead, she had received a glass of champagne to the face. She tapped the screen, her fingers steady. Her reply was a single word: proceed. She tucked the phone back into her clutch. The birthday ghost was done haunting the halls of her own life. Below her, the party continued, the guests oblivious to the fact that the foundations of the Sterling Empire had just shifted. Beau was still laughing, still drinking, still believing he was the king of the mountain. He didn't realize the mountain was about to move. Sloane turned away from the railing and headed toward her suite. She had 48 hours to prepare for the board meeting, and she intended to arrive in something much more striking than white silk. As she walked, she didn't feel the weight of the humiliation. She felt the weight of the evidence. The countdown had begun, and Beau Sterling had no idea that he had just toasted to his own destruction. The next morning, the Sterling estate was a tomb of polished marble and suffocating silence. Sloane Sterling sat in the sunroom, the bitter scent of over-roasted espresso hanging in the air as she watched the rain lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her white silk dress from the night before was likely ruined, a crimson wine stain serving as a permanent map of her brother's malice, but she didn't care. Her focus was entirely on the tablet in her lap, where the digital architecture of Vanguard Holdings lay waiting. The heavy glass doors creaked open, and Beau Sterling sauntered in. He was already dressed in a bespoke navy suit that cost more than most people's annual rent, looking entirely untouched by the previous night's debauchery. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't even look at her face. He simply reached for the silver coffee carafe, the clatter of porcelain against marble echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You're still brooding?" he asked, his voice light and dismissive. He took a slow sip, leaning back against the counter with an air of unearned victory. "Honestly, Sloane, the theatrics were a bit much. It was a glass of champagne, not a death sentence. You always did have a knack for sucking the air out of a celebration." Sloane didn't look up from her screen. She felt the familiar heat of indignation rising in her throat, but she channeled it into the steady movement of her thumbs scrolling through a list of offshore accounts. "I'm an auditor, Beau. I don't do theatrics, I do facts." "Then here's a fact for you," he snapped, his casual demeanor vanishing as he slammed his cup down. A few dark drops of coffee splashed onto the white marble, mirroring the wine on her dress. "I need you to sign off on the quarterly internal review by noon. I've already moved the capital for the Vane acquisition, and I don't need some mid-level bureaucrat, even if she is my sister, stalling the momentum of this company." "You moved capital that wasn't yours to move," she said quietly, finally meeting his gaze. He laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "Everything in this house and that office is mine. Father is too tired to care, and Mother knows who the real star is. You're just the help with a shared last name." As if on cue, Eleanor Sterling drifted into the room, her silk robe trailing behind her like a ghost. She didn't look at the coffee spill or the tension radiating from her daughter. She walked straight to Beau, smoothing the lapel of his jacket with a doting smile. "Don't be so hard on him, Sloane," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with practiced disappointment. "Your brother is the face of the Sterling Empire. You're the spine, dear, and spines are meant to stay hidden, supporting the body without making a scene. Just sign the papers and let us get through the board meeting tomorrow without any more of your moods." Arthur Sterling appeared in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the morning paper, his silence a heavy, complicit weight in the room. He didn't intervene. He never did. He simply turned a page, ignoring the way Beau smirked at Sloane, emboldened by their mother's loyalty. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., Beau said, leaning down until he was inches from Sloane's face. She could smell his expensive cologne, a scent that now signaled nothing but rot. "The board will approve the acquisition, and I'll be named chairman for life. Sign the audit, or I'll have you removed from the building by security. I'm done playing family with you." He turned and strode out, Eleanor following him while whispering praise about his vision. Sloane waited until the sound of their footsteps faded. She picked up her phone and dialed a secure line. "Marcus Thorne," a gravelly voice answered on the first ring. "It's time, Marcus," Sloane said, her voice as cold as the rain outside. "Is the Vanguard position fully leveraged?" "We own 80% of the debt Beau used to fund the Vane deal," Marcus replied. "The moment he announces the acquisition tomorrow, he'll be technically insolvent. You hold the keys to every single one of his personal assets, Sloane. He's spent money that Vanguard officially called in an hour ago." Sloane looked at the coffee stain on the marble. "Good. Make sure Juliana Vane receives the updated ledger this afternoon. I want her to know exactly whose money she's really taking." She ended the call and stood up, her fingers grazing the tablet. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in hours. Beau believed he was ascending to his throne, oblivious to the fact that Sloane had already dismantled the floor beneath it. Tomorrow, the board wouldn't be crowning a king. They would be witnessing an execution. 2 days before the annual Sterling gala, the atmosphere in Marcus Thorne's office was thick with the scent of high-grade espresso and the sterile, metallic chill of the air conditioning. Sloane sat perfectly still in the leather guest chair, her eyes fixed on the thick blue folder Marcus had placed on the mahogany desk between them. It was the physical manifestation of 3 years of quiet, meticulous hunting. Marcus leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. He looked at her with a predatory glint in his eyes that she had only ever seen in the courtroom. "It's more than we expected," he said, tapping the edge of the folder. "Beau didn't just forge your signature on the bridge loans. He's been using Sterling Industrial's physical assets, the warehouses, the fleet, even the patents, as collateral for personal lines of credit to fund his lifestyle. He's been operating a shell game for 18 months, Sloane. He's technically been insolvent since last Christmas." Sloane felt a cold, sharp satisfaction bloom in her chest. She reached out, her fingers grazing the smooth, heavy cardstock of the folder. Inside were the forensic audits, the wire transfer records, and the notarized affidavits from the bank managers Beau had bribed to look the other way. "And the Vanguard transfer?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "Complete," Marcus replied. "Vanguard Holdings now owns 80% of the debt Beau used to fund the Vane deal. You are officially the primary creditor for every asset he claims to own. He's walking into that gala thinking he's the king of the city. He doesn't realize he's already a tenant in his own house." Sloane stood, the weight of the evidence a comforting anchor in her bag. "He thinks the gala is his coronation. He's invited the entire board and the press to watch him sign the merger with Juliana Vane." "Then let him have his stage," Marcus said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "The higher he climbs, the more bones he'll break on the way down." The evening sun hit the limestone pillars of the Sterling estate with a deceptive warmth as she pulled her modest sedan into the drive an hour later. Inside, the foyer echoed with the sound of her brother's laughter, a loud, booming sound that lacked any real mirth. He was standing by the grand staircase, a glass of vintage scotch in one hand and a gold-plated watch in the other, admiring his reflection in the hallway mirror. Arthur stood nearby, nodding with a strained, weary smile, while Alina hovered over her son, adjusting his silk tie as if he were a prince preparing for battle. "There she is," Beau sneered as Sloane entered. He didn't even look at her face, his gaze sweeping over her sensible charcoal suit with visible distaste. The smell of his suffocatingly expensive cologne, something with notes of oud and arrogance, filled the foyer. "Sloane, please tell me you've hired a stylist for Saturday." Juliana Vane doesn't do business with people who look like they shop at a discount outlet. It's a bad look for the brand. Alina sighed, her voice laced with that familiar, sharp disappointment that always seemed reserved for her daughter. "He's only thinking of the family, dear. This merger is everything. Your brother has worked so hard to secure our legacy. The least you can do is look the part of a Sterling for once." Sloane felt the familiar prickle of heat behind her eyes, but she didn't let it reach her expression. She simply adjusted the strap of her bag, feeling the hard edge of the forensic report against her hip. "I'll make sure I'm memorable, Beau. Don't worry about me." "I don't worry about you," he snapped, taking a long, aggressive pull of his scotch. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal. "I worry about the deal. I've already moved the final tranche of the Vanguard funds to cover the closing costs. By Monday, I'll be the most powerful man in this sector, and you'll still be counting pennies in the audit department." He didn't notice the way Arthur's eyes flickered toward the floor in shame, or the way Sloane's thumb traced the seal on the folder hidden in her bag. The audacity was breathtaking. He was bragging about stealing her money to buy his own vanity project, all while standing in a house she technically already owned through Vanguard's debt acquisition. Sloane's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped into the kitchen, the scent of lavender polish and roasting lamb filling the air. It was a text from Marcus. "The ledger has been received. Ms. Vane is interested. Vanguard's formal call on the personal assets is scheduled for Saturday night, 9:00 p.m., exactly when he takes the stage." She looked back into the foyer. Beau was showing Alina the new cufflinks he'd bought, diamonds the size of marbles, likely paid for with the same forged signatures Marcus had spent months tracking. He looked so confident, so untouchable. He checked his reflection one last time, adjusting his cuffs with a smirk. Sloane gripped her phone, her heart beating a steady, rhythmic countdown. 2 days. In 48 hours, the lights would be at their brightest, the audience would be at its peak, and her brother would finally realize that the throne he'd built was made of nothing but her stolen paper. She turned away from the foyer, a small, cold smile finally touching her lips. The hunt was over. Now it was time for the kill. The following afternoon, the Sterling Manor felt less like a home and more like a stage being set for a tragedy. The air in the sun-drenched morning room was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of silver polish. Sloane Sterling sat at the edge of the mahogany table, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain cup. The espresso inside was over-extracted and bitter, much like the conversation happening across from her. Beau Sterling was in rare form. He lounged in his chair, his designer suit jacket tossed carelessly over a nearby antique settee. He was currently obsessing over the seating chart for the Vanguard gala, his thumb flicking across his phone's screen with a frantic, narcissistic energy. "I've moved Juliana Vane to the head table, right next to me," he announced, not looking up. "The Sterling name needs to be seen with that kind of old money royalty. It solidifies the image." He paused, finally casting a dismissive glance toward his sister. "I've put you at table 12, Sloane. It's near the exit. I figured you'd want to slip out early anyway, once the real business starts. You've always been better at hiding in the shadows of a ledger than handling a room." The insult was delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had forgotten who built the floor he was standing on. Sloane took a slow, measured sip of her coffee, the heat blooming in her chest. "Table 12, she repeated, her voice a calm, low vibration. "Are you sure that's wise, Beau? The view of the stage from the back can be quite revealing. You might see things coming that you wouldn't notice from the head of the table." He let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "What could I possibly miss? I'm the CEO. I'm the one holding the microphone. You just worry about staying out of the way of the photographers. I don't want your sensible wardrobe dragging down the aesthetic of the front row." Alina Sterling drifted into the room then, the silk of her robe hissing against the marble floor. She leaned down to kiss the top of Beau's head, pointedly ignoring Sloane. "He's right, darling. Tomorrow is about Beau's vision. We all have to make sacrifices for the family brand. If that means you sit in the back, then you sit in the back." The enabler's touch was the second spike of the morning. Sloane felt the familiar itch of outrage, but she channeled it into the secret power she carried in her pocket. Her phone buzzed, a haptic rhythm she'd assigned specifically to Marcus Thorne. She didn't need to look at it to know the final injunctions were signed. "I'm just thinking about the foundations," Sloane said, setting her cup down with a precise, echoing click. "A house looks grand until the ground shifts. Have you double-checked the Vanguard liabilities? I'd hate for a surprise to ruin your big toast." Beau waved a hand dismissively, his diamond watch catching the light and throwing a jagged reflection across the wall. "Vanguard is a partner, not a predator. They've been silent for months. Why would they start making noise now?" "You're projecting your audit brain onto a masterpiece of high finance." Stick to the spreadsheets, Sloane. Leave the Empire building to me. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He truly believed the silence was submission. He didn't realize that in the world of high-stakes litigation, silence was simply the breath taken before the scream. Sloane stood, the sound of her chair legs scraping against the marble like a warning bell they were both too deaf to hear. She walked toward the door, stopping only when she reached the heavy, cream-colored invitation resting on the sideboard. She ran a thumb over the embossed gold lettering, the Sterling assent. "I'll see you at the gala then," she said softly. "I'll be the one at table 12, watching." "Just make sure you're wearing something that doesn't photograph Gray," Beau called out after her, already turning back to his seating chart. Sloane stepped into the hallway, the cool air of the foyer hitting her face. She pulled out her phone. The message from Marcus was short. The formal call on the personal guarantees is loaded. Saturday 9:02 p.m. The moment he finishes his opening remarks. She looked at the grand staircase, at the portraits of Sterling's past who had built a legacy Beau was currently lighting on fire. She had given him every chance to be honest, every opportunity to come clean about the forged signatures and the stolen equity. He had chosen the spotlight instead. 24 hours remained. Sloane leaned against the cold stone wall, a small, icy smile touching her lips. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in heartbeats. And for the first time in years, her heart was beating in perfect, lethal sync with the clock. The evening of the Sterling Foundation Gala arrived with a crisp, biting wind that rattled the towering glass panes of the grand ballroom. Inside, the atmosphere was a suffocating blend of lilies, expensive oud, and the sharp, metallic tang of chilled champagne. Crystal chandeliers cast a fractured light over the 300 guests, their voices a low, rhythmic hum that sounded to Sloane Sterling like the drone of a hive before a storm. She stood near the perimeter of the room, her fingers tracing the stem of a crystal flute. The condensation was biting and cold, a necessary anchor against the heat of the crowd. She wasn't wearing the muted gray Beau had demanded. Instead, she had chosen a gown of midnight silk so dark it appeared black until the light hit the folds, revealing a deep, bruised violet. It was the color of a storm cloud at dusk, silent, heavy, and full of electricity. Beau Sterling was already at the center of the room, holding court beneath the largest chandelier. He looked every bit the conqueror in his bespoke tuxedo, a glass of vintage scotch gripped in a hand that had never known a day of honest labor. He was laughing, a loud, performative sound that drew the eyes of every socialite and investor in the radius. Beside him, Eleanor Sterling beamed, her hand resting possessively on her son's arm as if he were a prize she had personally polished. Sloane watched as Juliana Vane approached them. The socialite queen's eyes were sharp, scanning the room with the practiced boredom of the ultra-elite. When Beau leaned in to whisper something that made Juliana laugh, Eleanor's smile widened. It was a tableau of perfect, manufactured success. "You're late," a voice hissed near Sloane's ear. She didn't turn. She knew the scent of her mother's perfume, cloying jasmine and desperation. Eleanor had detached herself from Beau's side to intercept her daughter. Her eyes darted over Sloane's dark gown, her lips thinning into a line of pure disapproval. "I told Beau you were probably struggling with your hair," Eleanor whispered, her voice tight with the need to maintain appearances. "Why are you wearing that? It's far too dramatic. You look like you're attending a funeral, Sloane. Go to the back of the room. Beau is about to announce the new expansion, and he doesn't need your energy distracting the donors." "It's a gala, Mother," Sloane said, her voice a calm, low vibration. "Black is traditional." "It's funereal," Eleanor snapped, her fingers digging into Sloane's forearm for a brief, stinging second. "Just stay out of the way. Today is about your brother's legacy. Don't ruin it with that sour face of yours. Arthur is already in the VIP lounge with the board members. Try to act like you belong in this family for once." Eleanor turned on her heel, smoothing her skirts before gliding back toward the light. Sloane felt the phantom heat of her mother's grip on her arm. She didn't flinch. She simply took a slow sip of her water, her eyes moving to the balcony. Marcus Thorne was there, partially obscured by a marble pillar. He caught her gaze and gave a single, imperceptible nod. He held a leather portfolio against his side, his expression as unreadable as a stone wall. The pieces were all on the board. The board members were seated. The press was positioned. The witnesses were drinking the Sterling's champagne, unaware that the vintage was about to turn to vinegar. At 8:45 p.m., the lights dimmed slightly, signaling the transition to the formal program. Beau stepped onto the raised dais at the front of the room, the microphone emitting a soft, expectant hum. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the light, and looked out over the crowd with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world was his inheritance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Beau's voice boomed, amplified and rich, "if I could have your attention." Sloane moved through the crowd, her dark dress allowing her to slip between the guests like a shadow. She didn't go to the back as she'd been told. She moved toward the front, stopping just 10 feet from the stage, directly in Beau's line of sight. Beau noticed her. His eyes flickered, a brief flash of irritation crossing his handsome face before his professional mask snapped back into place. He leaned into the microphone, his smile widening. "Tonight is about more than just charity," Beau said, gesturing toward the giant digital screen behind him. "It's about the future of the Sterling legacy. It's about the bold steps we're taking to ensure Vanguard Holdings remains the gold standard of the industry. I've spent the last 6 months personally overseeing a restructuring that will triple our impact." A smattering of polite applause broke out. Arthur Sterling stood near the front, nodding with a grim sort of pride, while a leaner looked on as if she were watching a coronation. Sloane reached into her small, beaded clutch. Her fingers brushed the cool surface of her phone. She felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. The rage that had burned in her chest for years hadn't vanished. It had simply condensed into a diamond-hard point of focus. Beau continued, his tone becoming more intimate, more conspiratorial. "There are those who said we were overextended, those who doubted the vision. But as the CEO of this firm, I've always believed that fortune favors the bold. And tonight, I'm proud to announce—" Sloane's phone vibrated in her hand. One short pulse. 9:00 p.m. She looked up at her brother. He was in the middle of a sentence, his hand raised to gesture toward the screen where a promotional video was supposed to play. He looked powerful. He looked untouchable. Sloane didn't look away. She didn't blink. She watched as the first technician in the back of the room frowned at his monitor. She watched as Marcus Thorne stepped out from behind the pillar on the balcony, looking down at the stage like an executioner. Beau caught Sloane's eyes again. He saw the small, lethal smile playing on her lips, and for the first time that evening, his confidence wavered. His voice stumbled over a word, a tiny crack in the foundation. He cleared his throat, his hand tightening on the edge of the podium. "I'm proud to announce," Beau repeated, his voice slightly higher now, "the official launch of the Sterling Global Initiative." He clicked the remote in his hand, signaling for the video to begin. The screen behind him didn't show the glossy corporate montage he expected. It didn't show the Sterling logo or the images of smiling children. The screen flickered, a harsh white light filling the ballroom, and then a series of high-resolution documents appeared. They were bank statements, forensic audits. And at the very top, in a font large enough for the back row to see, was a signature, Beau's signature, juxtaposed with the forged version of Sloane's name on a personal guarantee for $40 million. The room didn't erupt. It did something far more terrifying. It went absolutely, hauntingly silent. Sloane took a step forward, the silk of her dress whispering against the floor. She watched the color drain from Beau's face, the tan he'd cultivated in the Hamptons turning a sickly, translucent gray. He turned his head slowly, looking at the screen behind him, his mouth falling open but no sound coming out. The countdown had ended. The heartbeats were no longer in sync. The storm had finally broken. The hum of the cooling fan in the overhead projector was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the ballroom. Sloane Sterling stood perfectly still, the weight of the microphone in her hand feeling like a scepter. On the massive screen behind her, The forensic audit glowed in high definition, a digital autopsy of her brother's greed. The forged signatures were unmistakable, Beau's hurried, arrogant scrawl juxtaposed against the elegant, precise script he had tried to mimic. Beau's features didn't just fall, they seemed to dissolve. The arrogance that usually defined the set of his jaw vanished, replaced by a frantic, rhythmic twitching near his left eye. His skin, once bronzed and polished, took on the hue of wet parchment, slick with a sudden, greasy sweat that matted his hairline. His mouth hung slightly agape, his lower lip trembling with a silent, aborted excuse that died before it hit the air. He looked smaller, his expensive tuxedo suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for a man who had finally run out of room to lie. His eyes darted across the room, searching for a friendly face, but found only a wall of cold, glittering judgment. His complexion shifted from a sickly pallor to a mottled, desperate red, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk tie like trapped snakes. Every time he tried to swallow, his Adam's apple bobbed convulsively, a physical manifestation of the panic clawing at his throat. The polished, predatory mask he'd worn for years had shattered, leaving behind a hollowed-out boy caught with his hand in the vault. Juliana Vane was the first to move. She set her champagne flute down on a passing server's tray with a sharp, metallic clack that echoed like a gunshot. She stepped back from Beau, her silk gown rustling as she physically distanced herself from the social wreckage. Her expression, once one of bored indulgence, had sharpened into a mask of pure, aristocratic disdain. "Sloane!" Beau finally wheezed, his voice cracking. He took a staggering step toward her, his hands reaching out as if to snatch the images out of the air. You've manipulated this. This is a hit job. You're jealous because I'm the one who built the Sterling legacy while you sat in a cubicle." Eleanor Sterling let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat as she looked from the screen to her son. "Beau, tell them it isn't true," she whispered, though her eyes remained fixed on the $40 million figure on the display. Beside her, Arthur Sterling didn't say a word. He simply lowered his head into his hands, his shoulders slumping in the posture of a man who had finally stopped pretending he couldn't see the rot in his own house. "I didn't build this, Beau," Sloane said, her voice amplified and steady, cutting through his desperate rambling. "I saved it. While you were busy forging my name to fund your lifestyle, I was the one ensuring there was still a company left to save." Marcus Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the wings, his presence as sharp and lethal as a blade. He held a leather-bound folder, but he didn't open it. He didn't need to. "The board has already been briefed, Beau," Marcus said, his voice carrying to the very back of the room. "And as the legal representative for Vanguard Holdings, I'm here to inform you that your personal assets have been frozen pending a full criminal investigation into the embezzlement of $40 million. Vanguard." Beau spat the word like it was poison, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "They're the majority shareholders. They've been buying our debt for months. What do they have to do with you, Sloane?" Sloane stepped off the podium, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor as she walked toward him. The scent of cloying lilies from the floral arrangement seemed to vanish, replaced by the sharp, clean ozone of the projector. She stopped inches from him, looking up into his crumbling face. "I am Vanguard, Beau," she said quietly, the microphone catching every syllable. "I didn't just audit the books, I bought the debt. I own the Sterling name, this building, and every cent you think you have in your pocket." The room erupted into a feverish whisper. Juliana Vane leaned toward her husband, her eyes fixed on Sloane with a new, terrifying respect. Beau opened his mouth to shout, to scream, to lie one last time, but Sloane didn't give him the chance. She handed the microphone to a stunned waiter and turned her back on him. "Security will show you out, Beau," she said over her shoulder. "You're trespassing on my property." She walked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom, her head held high. Behind her, the sound of security guards moving in was drowned out by the sudden, frantic shouting of his name, but Sloane Sterling didn't look back. She had spent a lifetime in the shadows of his arrogance, She wasn't going to spend another second watching him fall. The heavy oak doors hadn't even latched behind her when the roar of the ballroom fractured into 1,000 panicked questions. Sloane paused at the threshold, her hand resting on the cool brass handle. She didn't turn back, but she could feel the vacuum created by her revelation, a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure that left the elite of the city gasping for air. "She's lying!" Beau's voice tore through the refined silence, cracking at the edges. It was a desperate, ugly sound that lacked his usual practiced resonance. "The girl is delusional. Security, why are you standing there? Get her out of my building." But the guards didn't move toward Sloane. Instead, they formed a silent, black-clad semicircle around the stage, their eyes fixed on the man who had been paying their salaries with borrowed time. Marcus Thorne stepped into the vacuum. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who had spent 20 years in courtrooms waiting for this exact moment of blood in the water. He didn't raise his voice, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the vaulted ceiling, cutting through Beau's frantic protests. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, pulling a thick, cream-colored folder from his leather briefcase. The sound of the zipper was like a gunshot in the hushed room. "As the legal representative for Vanguard Holdings, I am here to serve the formal injunction. Your access to all corporate accounts was terminated at 7:00 p.m. tonight. Your personal assets, which were leveraged against the Sterling Group's debt now held entirely by my client, have been frozen pending a full forensic audit of the signatures you forged." Beau's face was a study in geological erosion. The arrogant flush that usually defined his features had curdled into a sickly, translucent gray, making the sweat beads on his forehead look like oily pearls. His jaw didn't just drop, it hung slack, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that betrayed the frantic clicking of his teeth. His eyes, once wide with predatory confidence, were now bloodshot and darting, unable to find a single friendly face in a room that had been his kingdom only minutes prior. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man watching his own execution in a mirror he couldn't break. Juliana Vane, who had been standing at his side like a shimmering trophy, took a deliberate, clicking step backward. The sound of her stiletto on the marble was sharp and final. She didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment one might reserve for a stain on a rug. She adjusted her pearls, her gaze shifting toward the doors where Sloane stood, her expression transforming into one of calculated, terrifying respect. "Beau," Juliana said, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. "I believe you're in someone else's seat." The room erupted. The board members, men who had laughed at Beau's jokes and toasted his vision for years, were suddenly scrambling to distance themselves. One by one, they stepped away from the stage, their chairs screeching against the floor like a chorus of dying animals. Eleanor Sterling rushed forward, her silk gown rustling as she reached for Sloane's arm, her face a mask of practiced maternal concern. "Sloane, darling, surely we can talk about this. Your brother. He's impulsive, yes, but think of the family name. Think of the scandal. We can handle this quietly, in private." Sloane finally turned. She looked at her mother, seeing for the first time the sheer emptiness behind the carefully applied makeup. The smell of Eleanor's expensive, lily-scented perfume, which had always signaled safety in Sloane's childhood, now smelled like the cloying scent of a funeral parlor. "The family name belongs to me now, Mother," Sloane said, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. "And I've decided I don't like how it's been used. There is no private anymore. Beau didn't forge those signatures in private. He didn't humiliate me in private. He did it because he thought I was nothing." "Sloane, please," Arthur Sterling muttered, his voice weak as he stood behind his wife. He looked older, diminished, the light of his own complicity finally burning out. "He's your blood." "Blood is just a biological fact, Father. Loyalty is a choice. You chose him, I'm choosing the truth." Beau let out a guttural, choked sound, a laugh that turned into a sob. He lunged toward Marcus, reaching for the folder, but the security guards were faster. They caught him by the arms, his designer tuxedo bunching up around his shoulders, making him look small and ridiculous. "You can't do this." Beau screamed, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. I built this, I am Sterling. You're a tenant, Beau, Marcus replied, his voice devoid of pity. And your lease just expired. Sloane watched as the guards began to haul him toward the side exit. He kicked, his polished loafers scuffing the expensive floor, a man losing his soul and his status in the same breath. The guests watched in a morbid, electrified silence, phones raised to capture the fall of the Titan. She felt a strange, cold peace settle over her. The weight she had carried for years, the shame of his insults, the burden of her parents' expectations, it hadn't just vanished. It had transformed into the very foundation she was now standing on. She looked at Marcus, who gave her a single, sharp nod. The work was done. The empire hadn't just fallen, it had been reclaimed. Sloane turned away from the chaos, walking out into the cool night air. Behind her, she could hear the faint, fading sound of Beau's voice calling her name, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to answer. She stepped into the waiting car, the door closing with a heavy, expensive thud that silenced the world. Where to, Miss Sterling? The driver asked. Sloane looked at the city lights, the skyline she now partially owned, and felt the sharp, clean edge of the future. Forward, she said. Just forward. 6 months later, the air in the city had turned crisp, carrying the sharp scent of impending winter. Sloane Sterling sat behind a desk of reclaimed oak in her new office, 30 floors above the streets where she had once walked in the shadows of her brother's ego. The space was silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the espresso machine in the corner and the occasional muffled chime of her private line. She wasn't in the Vanguard headquarters anymore. She had moved the executive offices to a glass and steel spire overlooking the harbor, creating a physical distance between the new era and the wreckage of the old one. Marcus Thorne tapped on the open glass door before stepping inside. He looked as sharp as ever, though the usual predatory gleam in his eyes had softened into something resembling professional satisfaction. He placed a slim leather folder on her desk. The final liquidation is complete, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the minimalist room. The Sterling family estate in the Hamptons sold this morning. After the creditors were satisfied, there was exactly enough left to cover your parents' new residence. Sloane didn't open the folder. She didn't need to. She had authorized every penny of the transaction. And the condo? A lien is settled, he replied, adjusting his cufflink. It's a 2-bedroom in a quiet part of Connecticut. It's modest, but the medical insurance you quietly funded is already active. Arthur seems relieved. He spent most of the week in the garden. And the other one? She asked, her voice steady. Marcus paused, a small, grim smile touching his lips. Beau is exactly where his choices landed him. He's in a 400-square-foot studio in the Heights. I believe he's currently working as a junior floor manager for a logistics firm. They don't know who he is, Sloane. To them, he's just a middle-aged man with a resume full of gaps and a temper he can't afford to lose. She nodded, feeling a strange, hollow click in her chest. It wasn't joy. It was the sound of a debt finally being marked as paid. The door to the conference room opened 20 minutes later. Beau walked in, and for a moment, Sloane almost didn't recognize him. The tailored Italian wool suits were gone, replaced by a polyester blend blazer that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning at the temples, and the arrogance that used to radiate from him like heat had curdled into a frantic, twitchy desperation. He didn't sit. He gripped the back of the chair, his knuckles white. You really did it, he rasped, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cheap cigarettes. You stripped everything. Mom is crying herself to sleep in a place that's smaller than my old walk-in closet, and you're sitting up here like a queen. I saved them from the street, Beau, she said, her voice like a calm, deep pool of water. Which is more than they would have had if I'd let your fraud go to trial. You should be thanking me for the NDAs. Thanking you? He let out a harsh, jagged laugh that set her teeth on edge. This was the first rage spike, the familiar, toxic entitlement bubbling to the surface. You stole my company. You manipulated the board. You turned Marcus against me. I didn't turn anyone, she interrupted. I simply stopped paying for the lies. You were a parasite, and the host finally got healthy. He leaned over the table, his face flushing a deep, ugly purple. I need a loan, Sloane, just 50,000. For Mom, she needs things. High-end things she's used to. You're the one with the Sterling name on the door now. You owe the family that much. The second rage spike hit her then. The sheer audacity of him weaponizing their mother's comfort to fund his own inability to live a modest life. The family name is off the door, Beau, she said, sliding a single document across the table. I rebranded last month. It's just Vanguard now. And as for the money, you've already had your share. It's in the legal fees I paid to keep you out of a jumpsuit. She watched the color drain from his face as he looked at the document. It was an eviction notice for his studio apartment. His eyes darted to hers, wide and panicked. What is this? Wait for it, Marcus whispered from the corner. Vanguard Holdings purchased that building last Tuesday, Sloane said, her voice dropping an octave. It was part of a larger portfolio. I didn't even know you lived there until the tenant list came across my desk this morning. You're kicking me out. He stammered, his voice cracking. Where am I supposed to go? The same place you told me to go 5 years ago when you forged my name to the inheritance waivers, she said, standing up slowly. The power in the room shifted, pinning him against the chair. You told me the world didn't owe me a living. I suggest you take your own advice. He opened his mouth to shout, to plead, to throw one last insult, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the vast, expensive view behind her, then down at his own shaking hands. He looked small. For the first time in his life, he looked exactly as large as his character. Security will show you out, she said. She watched him go, his shoulders slumped, his footsteps heavy on the plush carpet. When the door clicked shut, the silence returned, but it felt different now. Heavier. Sloane walked to the window. In her hand, she held a small, silver-framed photograph she'd taken from the old house, a picture of her and Beau as children, sitting on a tire swing. She looked at the boy in the photo, searching for a trace of the man who had just left. She found nothing. She set the photo face down on the shelf. The victory was absolute, the justice proportional, but the cost was the ghost of a family that had never really existed. She looked out at the skyline, the lights beginning to flicker on like diamonds scattered across the dark velvet of the city. She was the owner of it all, and she was entirely alone in the sky. Forward, she whispered to the glass. Just forward.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.